Hello, this is Lord's Legion and welcome to the best villains ever. The show in which I talk about a specific villain and talk about their backstories, abilities, greatest feats and why I love them so much. Now this is going to be more or less the Halloween special episode, but considering how Jigsaw has finally came out, I think it would be more appropriate to release this episode earlier than Halloween. So that way we're actually celebrating the release of the new Jigsaw film. And seeing as how I banged on about Jigsaw and the Saw franchise quite a lot already in the intro, it's crystal clear at this point that the villain I'm going to be focusing on is John Kramer, aka the Jigsaw Killer. So without further ado, let's begin with his backstory, and bear in mind his origin is rather lengthy, so I'll try and condense it as best as I can and try and give you guys a brief overview of Jigsaw's origin. Now, John Kramer was a successful civil engineer and the founder of the Urban Renewal Group, which was a foundation dedicated for property development for people who are less fortunate. But not only that, he was also married to Jill Tux, and was even expected to have a child together. And as a little hobby, John decided to buy a workshop for himself and create other things, such as the early version of Billy the Puppet. And things were really looking up for him. However, things went through a dark turn as the longer Jill was carrying the baby whilst working in a clinic full of drug addicts, things went for the worst, as one of the drug addicts from the clinic known as Cecil Adams accidentally slammed the door on Jill's stomach while she was 8 months pregnant, and despite all their best efforts they were unable to save the baby, therefore Jill had a miscarriage. And because of this, John Kramer became severely depressed and ultimately decided to isolate himself from pretty much everyone. However, things go bad to worse as John Kramer was diagnosed with terminal cancer as well as an inoperable brain tumour. And despite all the treatment that John tried, nothing was working for him. However, John Kramer eventually found out about an experimental surgery in Norway, so he decided to go to his insurance company and see if he's allowed to do it. Unfortunately, experimental surgery was not in their policy, so unfortunately they wouldn't allow that. At this point, John Kramer had seemingly no hope, so he attempted to take his own life by driving off a cliff. But surprisingly, John Kramer survived the whole ordeal. And even stranger, John had a new realization that due to his near-death experience, he actually appreciates life for what it is. And now that John Kramer finally has purpose in life, he decided to go by the name the Jigsaw Killer and started to work on his new life mission to more or less kidnap those who don't appreciate life and then set them onto various death traps just to test their will of survival. And if they escape from all of his death traps, then they have proven themselves to be worthy of staying alive. And to all those who fail the tests, well, it's all on them. Now on the surface, if you look at the Jigsaw Killer, then you would just think of him as a complete monster. But when you dig deeply into his origin story as well as his personal beliefs, then you can kinda see where he's coming from. John Kramer is a human being who slowly but surely lost his humanity due to the loss of his unborn child, as well as his depression and even his cancer. But ever since he donned the identity of the Jigsaw Killer, it does seem like John Kramer is no more. Now, given how grounded the Saw series is, Jigsaw himself doesn't really have any powers or anything crazy like that. However, his most dangerous asset is of course his cunning mind, as well as his background on his engineering. So because of this, Jigsaw is capable of setting out various death traps for those who he deems unworthy of living. But not only that, Jigsaw also does have plenty of people who would work for him in order to achieve his goals. Most notably his many apprentices who are willing enough to carry on his legacy, even long after his death. What's really fascinating about how the Jigsaw Killer deals with his victims is the fact that their fates are solely in their hands. So really, John Kramer has no blood on his hands at all, and that all of his victims' deaths are their own doing, which as far as I'm concerned has never been done when it comes down to a horror movie killer before, which kinda makes the Jigsaw Killer stand out above from the rest. So at this point in this video, I think it would be pretty good if we were to focus on some of my personal favourite traps in the Saw franchise. And the reverse bear trap is a really good one to start with, as this is by far the most iconic trap in the Saw series. Also, the rack from Saw 3 is quite possibly one of the most painful traps in the entire series, and you would have to watch it yourself to believe. A similar trap, although debatably more painful, is of course the Angel Trap, which also was introduced in Saw 3. The flammable jelly trap was also very memorable from the original, and was also a good test psychologically. And then we also have Saw 5's 10 Pints of Sacrifice, which was also incredibly brutal, and it also requires 2 people to deal with the same amount of pain. The needle pit from Saw 2 was also extremely memorable, which must be incredibly frightening if you do have a fear of needles. A Pound of Flesh from Saw 6 was also quite possibly one of the more difficult ones to watch, but as I could imagine, it could have been much worse if you actually witnessed it in real life, to which you could actually say for most of these traps. The Death Mask from Saw 2, or some people call as the Venus Flytrap, was also a pretty brutal death, and it gets extra points for being an upgraded version of the traditional reverse bear trap. The bathroom trap from Saw 4 was also a memorable one, and probably one of the more satisfying deaths. And then we also have Saw 3's shotgun collar, which is pretty horrifying, and especially the end result. The knife chair trap from Saw 4 was also a pretty good one, especially how this was the first official trap within the timeline. The razor wire maze from the original Saw film was also a pretty memorable trap. And then we also have the pendulum trap from Saw 5, which was pretty brutal, especially how the trap was inescapable. And finally we have the Molesium trap from Saw 4, to which again, much like a lot of these traps, was a great test both physically and mentally. And at this point I may as well give my personal thoughts on the Saw franchise and how I feel about them as a whole. And there's no two ways about this, but the fact is the first one is the best, because at the time there was nothing quite like Saw. But then we also got Saw 2, which was a decent follow-up, and then Saw 3 was a pretty good conclusion to what could have been a solid trilogy. And then the more as they went on, the more they kind of became stale and repetitive, and although they do have their moments here and there, for the most part, the series just became a one-trick pony. And honestly, seeing all the flashbacks of the Jigsaw Killer was a huge saving grace for the other Saw films after 4, because Tobin Bell does a phenomenal job as the character, and I don't think the Jigsaw Killer would have worked as well if it weren't for his performance. And honestly, I haven't seen the new Jigsaw film yet at the time of this recording, but to my understanding, Jigsaw is meant to be a soft reboot of sorts where it ignores all the events of Saw 4 onwards. And I know it's been a long time since the last Saw film, but I'm hoping that this film will at the very least be something new, like a completely different take on the mythos, because if you want to bring a dead franchise back, then you have to give it meaning and make the new series fresh, which is something I want out of this new series of Jigsaw films. But overall, the Jigsaw Killer is an extremely fascinating villain, because for the most part he's just a tragic figure who's trying to rebuild himself as something new. But unfortunately, not many people see things his way, because John Kramer believes that he's doing the right thing by taking out everyone who doesn't deserve to live. And although questionable, he still has his morals. And because of this, Jigsaw is quite possibly one of the most complex and cunning villains in movie history. And how he allows his victims to seal their fates without even getting his hands dirty is just the icing on the cake, which again complements his intelligence. So because of his very tragic backstory as well as his very interesting moral compass, not to mention how he allows his victims to pretty much kill themselves if they fail to do his tests, and just how unique he really is as a character, this is why I personally believe that Jigsaw is one of the best villains of all time. So are you a fan of the Jigsaw Killer, and what is your personal favourite death traps within the Saw franchise? Comment below and share some thoughts. And as always, thank you guys for watching this video. Please like and subscribe. Take care and have a good one.